Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Innovation Circuit. I'm Sudeep Ghatak, practice lead in the digital team here at Theta. I'm joined by John Vanderwald, delivery unit lead in our Dynamics 365 team. Hello, John.
Hello, Sudeep.
And by Ivor Whibley, a principal consultant in the D365 practice, who has been implementing systems for over 40 years. Hello, Ivor.
That's correct. Yes. Hi, Sudeep.
So today we are talking about a challenge many organizations are facing right now, which is why some GenAI proof of concepts struggle to make it to production. And now with generative AI, it's relatively easy to get started. You can stand up a demo quickly, generate content, summarize documents, draft responses, and you can do all that in a very short period of time. But taking the same idea into production is a very different story. That's where the hard questions start to emerge. Questions around security, governance, data exposure, trust, accuracy. Questions that were not really being discussed when everyone was crowded around a laptop in a workshop. So today we'll unpack the difference between a POC, a pilot, and production in a Gen AI context. We'll explore why so many organizations are willing to experiment, but far few are willing to operationalize. And we'll get into what actually needs to happen for AI to move into impressive demo to something that people use every single day. So, John, let's start with you. In Gen AI context, how should the organizations think about the difference between a proof of concept, a pilot, and production? And how can the thinking be focused on the success part?
Yeah, thanks, Sudeep. I think that's a very good point to make the distinction between a proof of concept or POC or POC, as it's sometimes known as well, and a pilot and a production system, because they all have different purposes and reasons why you would do that, though. So to start off with a proof of concept, it's really about testing feasibility. It's time boxed within a couple of weeks, and you're running sanitized or dummy data. And the point there is to make sure that is it feasible that the system can actually work? Is it a possibility that it can do that though? And then if you look at a pilot, or this is more likely to be a prototype as well, this is where you start working with real data, real people, and a real business context, and you run it in a limited capacity for a specific period of time. But here the goal shifts from does it work to does it work for us in our environment and with our people. And then lastly, you have production, which is a completely different commitment as well. Now you're taking the pilot that you've done, or and that you've moved from a POC, and you're putting into production. And now you need to start tracking return on investment. Can you support it? Do I have any data concerns? What's the quality of the data or the feedback on the prompts that I'm getting from Gen AI? And you need to start watching very closely about how the system is actually being operated, and whether there's a seemingly a success coming from it though. The problem is that companies fall in love with the POC, and that they're surprised that there's a big gap between the proof of concept that they wanted to see or thought that might work and what's actually happening in production. The moment you throw real data at Gen AI, then it becomes a very different animal to deal with. And now you need to start security. Are people using it? Are they using it correctly? Are you actually getting the result that you want?
Yeah, that's a really useful framing, John. And that phrase "fall in love with the POC" is really interesting because it suggests that the excitement itself might be part of the problem. So, Ivor, from your experience delivering business applications, why do you think many Gen AI POCs generate this excitement early on and they stall just before they are rolled out to production?
It's a good question, Sudeep. And I think that the common pattern, if we look specifically at the POC, by its nature, it's designed to be the best possible version of something. That's what it is. And it's being conducted under controlled conditions.
Yeah.
You're picking the use case that will look impressive to all of the people gathered around the table. But the stall seems to happen the moment you introduce some reality into the situation. I think there's sort of three things that you can consider there. First, that the POC is always built around a single, well-defined use case. So it's that specific case. And the moment you try and scale this, bring in more users, more data sources, edge cases, these limitations are likely to show. The model might not behave the same as it did when you had all the people in the room around the demo, and immediately people are going to question. Secondly, there's requirements. I'm a business analyst at heart. POC doesn't require you to do proper analysis. You're jumping in, and as you explained up front, AI, we can do this very quickly. Don't need to deeply uncover all the end-to-end processes, maybe not think about what happens in all of the specific edge cases, right? So, and you also don't need to figure out who owns the output or what happens when it goes wrong. Right? And then finally, I think there's a readiness question. Is the business process that this AI function that you're building actually well-defined? Right? Because if it's not well-defined, then you are automating something that's not well-defined. Okay, right. And the inconsistencies that you will find, and we find this when we implement any business system, and this has been going on for years and years and years. As Sudeep says, I've been implementing systems for many years. Right? If the processes are inconsistent, then the tools you're using will reflect that inconsistency. So it's not really an AI problem, it's a readiness problem, in my opinion.
So Ivor, you mentioned that the stall is really a readiness problem. And I think that
Correct.
connects very well to something broader about how our organizations approach GenAI versus other kinds of technologies like CRM and other things. So John, do you think organizations are actually more cautious with GenAI as they would be with any other traditional digital POC? And what would the success look like if you defined it upfront?
Yeah, I definitely think that GenAI is held to a higher standard than traditional projects, though. If you're implementing a normal system, like say normal, because a usual system, it fails in obvious ways. I mean, you get an error message, or the data output isn't what you expected, or the test cases that you've defined up front isn't met. These are obvious and usually easily fixable. However, because you're working with an interpretation of data, to put it that way, there's a higher standard in which you need to measure success. And it's simply because you need to make sure that the data you're getting is accurate and it's reflective of what you are expecting. The difficulty is if you get it wrong, that wrong information will get into a customer report, it'll get into an email to a customer, you can have the wrong case information. The consequences of that is quite dire, and it comes down to AI basically impersonating what a human can do. The second issue, though, is obviously that people don't understand what the technology can do. I have lots of conversations with my customers, and we talk about process engineering or process re-engineering using AI, and the difficulty is that they don't actually understand what the tool can do. So how do you improve or change or adopt your business processes using a tool that you don't understand? And that's where it becomes really difficult to start identifying use cases. Where do you start? How do you get on this bandwagon that the hype is quite significant on? Because companies feel the tension. They feel they do need to start adopting AI, or they'll be left behind, and which is a fairly valid concern. The third part is obviously then the governance layer, though. So once you've got AI and let's say you've got a few use cases running, how do you control it? How do you make sure that your costs are being contained? How do you ensure security, your sovereignty and compliance obligations? So that these things become really, really difficult to plan. And again, going back to Molly's point on a technology that you don't really understand. And this is kind of where we as consultants come in, is where we need to help help advise our customers about where do you start, how do you control costs, and it's a fast moving field. My advice is always, start small, find that piece of use case that will make a big difference or a huge impact, but it needs to be small. And if you start small, you go on the journey and you learn together. You learn as you get the use case in, you learn from it, you get experience, and you go on the next one and the next one and the next one. And it could possibly be that you end up doing a use case or a business case that doesn't work. It just doesn't meet the ROI requirements, or it doesn't do what you thought it's going to do. That's also fine, because again, you'll learn from it though, and it's you learn by doing. In AI.
Yeah, John, you touched on something that I think is really critical, that confident, articulate, wrong answer that AI sometimes gives. And that brings me to something practical, because that risk doesn't show up in the POC, and it actually shows up when you actually try to put this in people's hands. So, Ivor, when teams make that move, from something impressive in a workshop to something that has to work every single day, what are the real barriers that start to surface?
Sudeep, I'll sort of pick up on something John said earlier. He touched on data. Data is the first thing, and it's the most important area, and it's probably the one that surprises people the most, because the assumption is that the data is going to be fine. Yeah. But it almost always never is, not to the standard that AI needs. There's a different standard in data. Data cleansing tools have been around for years. There are capabilities to make your, or to improve the quality of your data. Let me give you a concrete example in this for AI. You take a CRM application where the solution is going to generate a summary after a sales call. So you've got one of your sales team going out making a call. In a demo, this looks genuinely impressive, it really does. This model pulls together all the key points, the activities that were taken up, follow-up emails, and the sales leadership, and all the lights go on because they can see exactly how it's going to save their sales team time. But then you go to the real environment and you discover that the sales team discipline is not the same across the whole team. Right? There's obviously those superstars that enter everything. Some enter the bare minimum. And let's be honest, there's others that will do it on Friday afternoon or just before the sales meeting the following Tuesday. Right? So when AI is generating a summary from the data and the data is incomplete, right, that summary is just going to be wrong. But then the tool gets the blame. But a tool didn't fail. It's a data discipline that failed here. And then beyond that, and I think John also sort of indicated a little bit, this is to do with change management. People have got to change the way they work to work with this kind of tool. So if you're expected to update your call afterwards and capture all that information so that it's feeding back, then you need to do that. And that involves change. Folk need to be sort of explain why we're doing this and what's the benefit, because there's always needs to be a benefit for the user. And then finally, operational support, Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call when something goes wrong? In the workshop's easy. You can speak to John, right? Or Sudeep is sitting over here. But when it's in production, who do you phone? And does that person have the all-encompassing capability to jump in and help you? Solution simple. For example, you could use dictation in a car. We've seen that with AI. So after the call, talk into your microphone, and there's the data, and it's there. And then the results become impressive.
Yes, Ivor. I think that example is really telling one, where you said that the tool wasn't the problem, the inputs were. And I think that gets at something a lot of organizations are missing right now. Because, John, we are seeing this huge wave of co-pilots, assistants, chat-based tools that are being rolled out. And from what you both are describing, the danger is at the excitement that stays focused on the tool itself, whereas the real question should be, what is the business outcome? Are you seeing that problem as well?
Yeah, definitely. Copilots and similar tools have a very impressive surface area. I mean, Copilot's embedded in all of the Microsoft applications, and Dynamics 365, it's deeply embedded as well. There's a lot of benefit in using Copilot, but the question then becomes, how do business profit, for lack of a better word, by using GenAI? And this is where the metrics become important, because people can use Copilot or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever the case may be, but using it doesn't necessarily have an ROI. And it's the metrics that become important, the upfront decision that you make when you're identifying the use case. Say, what's the result that I want to see out of this? Do I want to see less time spent? Are my people spending time on work that they really shouldn't be spending the time on, that can be taken care of by something like AI, which means that time can be spent elsewhere in a more profitable manner. So you are removing barriers in the business, what people do, where people are doing a repetitive, low-level work, where AI can be much more suited for that, though. So, and then it's really important that you make sure that these metrics are defined up front and that they are constantly measured. And also, at the same time, I think a lot of companies and people are underestimating the amount of refining that has to be done with AI. There's one thing having a good prompt, but as you get more data through it and you see the quality of the output, refining, and updating and updating. As new language models come out, there are changes that needs to be made. So there's a constant evolution of the technology, and the business have to be taken. They have to keep that in mind as they implement Copilot. Gone are the days where you implement a system and it will stay like that, for 20 years. So we've seen a lot of the technology is simply moving too fast, and companies simply have to keep up.
Yeah, John, we have heard this so many times, right? We have this tool. How do we get people to use it? That leads me to something I hear quite often. That's the line, we've bought the licenses, and so now we have to make that uptake. Ivor, are you hearing that too? And does that mindset tend to miss?
Sudeep, I've heard the sentiment, if not exactly in those words, and I understand where it comes from. It's a frustration that if you're making a commitment, you're not seeing it reflected in usage. But that's just the beginning of the journey. There are elements to this, and they include training, change management, etc. But probably the biggest thing is time. People need time to work with the tool, learn it. I've seen this with CRM over the years. I recently revisited a CRM that I implemented in 2012, and I hadn't seen the system for years. And I remember when we did the implementation, we had Pizza Fridays with their sales team, where we sat around eating pizza, drinking beer, and capturing their customer contacts into the CRM because the data was a mess. But I look at it today, all these years later, wow, it's just fantastic. They've managed to keep that going. So it's a really good example of using the tool and working with the time, getting the training right, getting the data right. So you got to think about what you're actually asking your people to do. Not everything is going to be pizza and beer. They have a day job, right? They've got work to do, and any tool takes time. And what you've got to bear in mind, if you sit down and you spend the whole morning trying to do something and actually doesn't do what you're expecting it to do, and then you wake up at lunchtime and you realize you've got a whole lot of emails you haven't done, and there's a whole lot of work out there, you might not be that comfortable next time to jump in and spend 4 or 5 hours on something. So the adoption stalls there. Okay? It's not because they resist it, but there's lots of ways we can work with busy people today. Set up support groups inside the organization, the guys who actually know and work with it. I've seen like-minded people discussing, working, having great success. I think that's the impetus that needs to be brought to play here.
Yeah, I completely agree. You have to earn the time investment and work together, read blogs, reach out and get support. And I think that's really a very important point. And it implies that there's a right way to build that trust and demonstrate that value early on. John, what does a more outcome-led approach actually look like in practice? If an organization generally wants to succeed, where does it begin?
The most difficult part is finding that first use case. And it's really finding a pain point that's solvable with AI. And it's sometimes it's not always where the senior leadership or the executive team thinks the pain is. It's where the users are finding things frustrating in their day job. A good way to start is always to look for knowledge management or document processing. I mean, these are two very straightforward places where you can look at for use cases. AI is very good at consolidating different data sources. For example, if your company policies are sort of all over the place, or even if it's located very conveniently inside SharePoint, for example, having an agent where you can say, give me my leave policy, or give me, my leave balances, or things like that, and it can go off and find all the information that it needs. Document processing is another one. So if people need to evaluate documents that submit documents by the customers, and for example, is this a driver's license? Is this a passport? Is this a utility bill? Things like that. AI can do that quite quickly. That's a very good place to start. But again, it's about defining those metrics up front. What are the measurable items you want to look for? What's the ROI? But again, most importantly, do something. Try it. See if it works. Go through the POC, do the pilot, run it in production, learn from it.
You mentioned finding an ally, someone who uses the tool because it solves their problem. That actually connects to something I think is worth naming explicitly, which is how you spot the opposite. When the program has drifted away from that and become too focused on the technology for its own sake, what are the practical warning signs you can see? And when it's happening, how do you course correct? Ivor?
The most obvious sign, I think, is when you look around and see that the only people using the tool are in the IT department and the business users have quietly drifted away. It's essential that that doesn't happen. They can't be both the implementer and the primary user. But there are subtler signs as well. If the conversation is around features, what the tool can do, what the next update will include, what the roadmap looks like, that's probably giving you the wrong signals. And especially if you're looking at usage rather than business outcomes. X number of people have been using it, and this is how much time they're spending on it. That's a signal. But the business needs to articulate clearly how AI connects to something that actually things they care about. That's the signal, right? I've seen a sign before. You can see it in their smile, right? Course correction is simpler in concept than in practice. If you really think about it, you need to get out into the business, find a senior person, find something that genuinely irritates them. I've heard someone I know saying, I want to do stuff I hate. Find that problem that they have to do every week or every month and focus on that. Look at that one problem. Don't try and solve the whole world's problems at once. Just go after that problem. And you find when you solve that problem for a real person, for a real business problem, they become the advocate. They become the ally you were talking about. That's the reset. Stop trying to drive the adoption. Start trying to solve problems. That's really the nub of this. Okay. And when you do that, adoption will follow naturally.
Yes, Ivor, I like that idea of creating an advocate, someone who talks about it because it might have generally
solved their problem. Yeah.
Yeah, because AI doesn't just change the work, how it gets done, it starts to change what organizations expect from their people, right? And that culture shift can really be important. So, John, once AI tools are available, and people start to use it and start to see the capability, do you find that expectations then begin to shift? Like now they are more focused around output, faster turnaround, broader scope. And how careful should the leaders be if that's where it's heading?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you need to be cautious about how you adopt AI in your organization. So, you can give somebody a Copilot license and they can access Copilot through, the Windows or Office, but that's just a tool. You have to give them the training about on how to appropriately use it, because otherwise it just becomes a glorified Google search engine, which has absolutely no value. At the same time, once you have agents in place, you need to make sure that you get the realized gains, but also make sure that your company can grow with the tool or with those agents in place, though. Not go all of a sudden just because I'm able to close sales faster, then go and say, okay, but now all my salespeople, all their targets need to be double. That's not the right way of doing it. AI, it's a tool. You treat it as a tool. It's something to help somebody do their job. It's not there necessarily to replace somebody doing that job. And it's important to be deliberate and transparent as well. So I always advise my customers, if you're adopting AI, do not trust the output and always verify it. We still run the risk of hallucinations, and AI making stuff up. And that could be for a whole different reasons, and we can probably have a whole podcast about that as well. But, for example, if you're drafting an email or you're closing a case or you're doing automated case management, rather have AI do 80% of the work and let the human then check the last 20%. So if you're drafting an email, let AI write 80% of that email, but let the human or the customer service agent read the email and make sure everything in there is correct, and then send it off to your customer. Slow down, be deliberate about adopting AI, but make sure it works. And it's a process, and it's a journey. It takes time, and people need to get used to it. And companies, the adoption is going to take slightly longer than you think, but the realized gains are definitely there.
Yeah, John, I think it leads to one of the trickier cultural questions around AI, because if AI is contributing to a recommendation, a summary, or a decision, and something goes wrong, who actually owns it then? Ivor, how do you think accountability works when AI is part of the process?
It's a question that's coming up more and more at the moment. We've seen it with organizations and universities producing reports that appear to be incomplete or inaccurate. My view is that accountability is with the person or party that's got the decision-making capability, thinking. It's not really different from a junior analyst in an organization who builds an Excel report and gets the formula wrong, and then that formula gets transferred and eventually ends up in the board report, and it's incorrect. It's showing incorrect figures. The fact that the formula wrong doesn't transfer the accountability. It sits with the decision maker. It always has. But the difference with AI is the scale and the speed at which it's happening. Errors can be presented and acted upon immediately. Right? So you can do this, and the response is immediate, and it goes into the email or the Excel, and it's out the door before you can click your fingers. It makes what John was saying, checking the stuff, more and more important. It's not who's accountable, it's who checks it. What makes it work, and what checks and balances have you got in the business? For the older folk out there, I'll tell you a story that captures this nicely. Back in the days, we used to use carbon paper. Right? And we always used to say, carbon paper allows you to make your errors in triplicate. And whatever you wrote went straight through to the other sheets. AI is the same. The technology there was easy to use. It's been around for years, but we made mistakes. The lesson then is the same as the lesson now, right? Speed of production is not the same as accuracy of output. Even if you're making mistakes 3 times, right, someone's still got to check it. Someone still has to own that.
Yeah, great. So what I'm taking from this conversation is that the gap between a Gen AI proof of concept and sustained production use is significant, and it's really a technology problem. So it's primarily a data problem, and it's a process problem, and it's a change management problem. It's a cultural problem, and it's also a leadership problem, in that sense that leaders need to be honest about expectations, clear about outcomes, and should be patient about the timeline between the investment and the return. So the organizations that are going to get this right aren't necessarily the ones with big budgets, big AI budgets. They're the ones that start with real simple problems and stay close to the people actually doing the work, measure what's actually matters, willing to say honestly when things aren't working, and that's what leads to success. So John, Ivor, thank you both. It's been a really grounded and a practical conversation, and I think is the one a lot of people in the organizations right now will recognize and find useful. And thanks to everyone listening to Innovation Circuit. If this episode has been useful, please share it with your colleagues who are wrestling with exactly the same question, because I suspect there are more of them out there than any of us realize. So until next time, goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, thanks.